The Velcaran Grand Court was the most important room in the known galaxy. Every empire that mattered kept a seat inside it, and every empire that did not was reminded of that fact in quiet and painful ways. The walls of the court were carved from the stone of a dead star, black, smooth, and polished every morning by a team of servants who had been trained since childhood to believe that beauty was the first language of power. The ceiling climbed so far above the floor that warm clouds of vapor gathered near the top, and the light that poured through the tall crystal windows landed on silk robes, on scaled armor, on jeweled headdresses, and on creatures that had ruled their corners of the universe for thousands of years. 43 delegations sat in that chamber on the morning Sergeant Urel Doran took her post. 43 species, 43 flags, 43 sets of eyes that disagreed on nearly everything but managed to agree on one thing without ever having to say it out loud. Humans were new here. And new, in this court, meant unimportant. The Earth Coalition had earned its provisional seat in the galactic sovereignty only 14 months ago. A political victory that the human diplomats celebrated loudly and that most of the older species ignored the way a mountain ignores the wind. The seat came with conditions, with restrictions, with a long list of things the coalition was not yet permitted to vote on, speak on, or act on without the approval of a senior member. It was a seat at the edge of the table, the kind of seat where you could hear the conversation but were not allowed to join it. Ambassador Tessa Vane of the Earth Coalition was a sharp woman in her late 50s who wore her grey hair short and her patience long. She understood exactly what the seat meant and exactly what it did not mean, and she had spent 14 months working quietly to change the second thing into the first. She had also spent those 14 months requesting a personal guard detail from Earth's military, not because she feared for her life, but because she understood the language of this court. In a room full of creatures that measured power in symbols, showing up alone was the same as showing up weak. The military sent her Sergeant Urel Doran. Urel was 31 years old, medium height, with dark brown skin and close-cut natural hair that she kept neat under her uniform cap. She had served 8 years in the Earth Defense Forces, and she had spent most of those years in cold, quiet places doing cold, quiet work. She did not talk much, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing a person could do in a new place was listen. The Velcaran hosts assigned Urel her post on the morning of the first session. It was the worst post in the room. Not dangerous, just insulting. It sat in the far right corner of the chamber, near the narrow servants' corridor, where the light was dim and the air smelled faintly of the cleaning solution used on the floors. Every senior guard in the room stood near their delegation's table, visible and important, armor catching the crystal light. Urel's post was the kind of place you put someone when you wanted them to know, without saying a single word, that they did not matter. The Velcaran aide who showed her to the spot even smiled when he pointed to it, a slow, satisfied smile that needed no translation. Urel looked at the post, she looked at the aide, she said nothing, she walked to the corner, stood up straight, clasped her hands behind her back, and fixed her eyes on the far wall. That was at the first hour of the morning session. 6 hours later, she had not moved. Not once. Not a shift of weight, not a roll of the shoulders, not a glance to the side. She stood the way a statue stands, completely, perfectly, and unnervingly still. Her breathing was slow and controlled and invisible from a distance, and her face held the kind of calm that only comes from a person who has decided to be calm and genuinely means it. The session itself was loud and full of argument. The main topic of the day was the Expansion Accords, a sweeping set of trade agreements that would reshape how resources moved between the outer systems and the core worlds. For most of the delegations in the room, the Accords were about money and influence. For the Earth Coalition, they were about something closer to survival. Humanity's outer colonies were struggling, and fair trade routes meant the difference between those colonies growing or slowly dying over the next 100 years. Ambassador Vane sat at the Earth table and spoke carefully and precisely when she was given the floor. She made her points without anger, backed everything with numbers, and sat down each time without looking around to see how the room had responded. She had learned that looking for approval in this court was like looking for water in a desert. The other guards in the chamber moved constantly. They shifted from foot to foot, leaned against walls, and whispered to each other when their delegations were not watching. A Velcaran honor guard in polished black armor scratched the back of his neck at our 3 and caught a sharp look from his superior. A Drither soldier with 4 arms braced 2 of them against a pillar at our 4 because her legs were tired. These were not bad soldiers. Stillness for that long was simply not natural to most species in that room. The body wanted to move, and most bodies eventually listened to that want. Urel's body did not seem to have that conversation with itself. She heard every word spoken in that chamber, every argument, every negotiation, every side conversation between aides and counselors near the edges of the room. She heard it all and stored it in the quiet filing system of her mind, without changing her expression by a single degree. Queen Sovariel of the Dominion of Ash sat at the elevated center of the chamber on a throne carved from living coral that shifted color with her mood. She was tall, bone white, and draped from shoulder to ankle in bioluminescent silk that pulsed with soft gold light. She had ruled for 312 years and had seen everything this court had to offer. She had watched empires fall, alliances shatter, and proud kings weep at her feet. She did not expect to be surprised today. She first noticed the human guard at R2, not because Uriel did anything interesting, but because of the opposite, because she did nothing. In a room full of movement and color and noise, the small still figure in the dim corner pulled the eye the way a stopped clock pulls the eye. Wrong, out of place, worth a second look. At hour 4, the Queen looked again. At hour 6, she was still looking. She did not say anything to her first counsel. She simply watched, the way a person watches something they do not yet have a name for, with the quiet, careful attention of a creature who had survived 3 centuries by never dismissing the things she could not explain. The human had not moved. And in this court, where power was performed loudly and constantly, that stillness felt, in a way the Queen could not quite put into words, like the loudest thing in the room. The second session began 3 days after the first, and the mood in the court had changed. It was harder now, sharper, the way air gets sharp before a storm rolls in. 3 of the great houses had submitted formal objections to the expansion accords overnight, and the objections were detailed and carefully worded, which meant someone had spent a long time preparing them, which meant this was not a reaction, it was a plan. Ambassador Vane read the objections at dawn over cold coffee and said nothing out loud, but she brought Uriel into her private office before the session began and laid the papers flat on the desk and pointed to specific lines without speaking, the way experienced people sometimes communicate when they are not sure who is listening through the walls. Uriel read the lines. She nodded once. They went to the court. Uriel took her post in the far corner again. Same dim light, same faint smell of cleaning solution, same position, hands behind her. Back, eyes forward, weight evenly placed. She had been in that corner 3 times now, and the Velcaran aide who passed her each morning had stopped bothering to smile, not because he respected her, but because she had stopped being entertaining. She did not react to the insult, and an insult that gets no reaction eventually gets boring. The session opened with the formal reading of the objections. A senior Velcaran court reader stood at the central podium and read each objection in a flat, ceremonial voice that made the words sound like ancient scripture. The chamber listened with the kind of careful attention that people give to things they already know are going to matter. When the reading was finished, the floor was opened for response. Ambassador Vane stood. She was the smallest person at her table and one of the smallest in the room, but she stood the way tall people stand, shoulders back, chin level, voice carrying without needing to be raised. She began to speak, and she was 3 sentences in when the disruption arrived. It did not arrive loudly. That was the thing about it. It came in quietly, the way the worst things usually do. A Velcaran court aide, young, dressed in the silver and grey of the administrative staff, entered the chamber through the side door near the Earth Coalition's table. He carried a scroll in both hands, held out in front of him in the formal presentation posture that meant he was delivering an official document. Nothing about him looked wrong. His uniform was correct, his walk was measured, his expression was appropriately neutral. The scroll, according to the document he also carried, was a formal counterfiling from the registrar's office, a legal challenge to the Earth Coalition's provisional seat, citing irregularities in the original application documents. If accepted by the presiding court officer, it would freeze the coalition's participation in the Accord's vote entirely. The aide walked toward the Earth table. He was 12 steps away when Uriel moved. She did not run. She did not shout. She simply walked, fast and direct, from her corner to the aisle in front of the Earth table, and she stepped into the aide's path with one arm extended. Her hand closed around his wrist. Not hard, not violently, just firmly, at the precise point where the wrist bones meet, with a grip that made movement impossible without causing obvious pain. The scroll tilted in the aide's hands. Uriel's other hand came up beneath it and took the weight of it without letting it touch her palm. She held it flat, from underneath, between 2 fingers, without touching its surface. The aide went still. The chamber went still. Uriel turned the scroll slightly and looked at the underside of the end cap. It was small and brass-colored and it had been unsealed and resealed. The original wax was intact, but the seal lines did not match the standard registrar pattern. She had memorized the standard pattern the week before the first session, from a document image in the Coalition's briefing folder. The end cap also had a faint residue on its inner rim, colorless, almost invisible. The kind of thing you would not notice unless you were looking for it. She held the scroll out to the side without looking away from the aide. A Velcaran court security officer, who had been watching from the moment she moved, came forward and took it from her fingers. Then Uriel released the
Edesrist.
She stepped back. She returned to her post. She did not look at the Queen. She did not look at the chamber. She fixed her eyes on the far wall and stood up straight and clasped her hands behind her back. The whole thing had taken less than 5 seconds. The chamber did not return to normal after that. It stayed quiet in the way that rooms stay quiet when everyone in them is trying to process what they just saw and none of them are quite sure they processed it correctly. The court security officer took the scroll to a side table and opened it under examination light. 2 minutes later, he leaned over to the presiding court officer and spoke in a low voice. The presiding officer's crest, a fan of pale blue membrane along the top of his skull, rose to full height, which in Velcaran body language meant something between deep alarm and controlled fury. The aide was removed from the chamber. The scroll was removed from the chamber. The session was paused. In the break that followed, every delegation in the room found reasons to speak quietly among themselves. Aides leaned close to diplomats, diplomats leaned close to each other, and the noise level climbed back up to its usual level of controlled chaos. But there was something different underneath it now, a note of unease that had not been there before. Because what the room had just watched was not extraordinary in the way of explosions or speeches. It was extraordinary in a much quieter way. A guard had identified a threat that the court's own security apparatus had not caught. She had responded before anyone else in the room had finished deciding whether there was something to respond to, and then she had gone back to her corner and stood still. As if nothing had happened. As if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Queen Sovereal had not moved from her throne during any of it. She watched the aide leave, she watched the scroll leave, and then she turned her gaze back to the corner where Uriel stood. Her court dress shifted from gold to deep amber, the color, her advisors knew, of deep and focused thought. Her first counsel leaned close and whispered something. The Queen raised one hand slightly, a gesture that meant not now, and the first counsel leaned back. The Queen kept watching the corner. And the figure in the corner kept standing perfectly still. What the Queen was feeling was not admiration, not yet. It was something more unsettled than that. It was the sensation a very powerful person feels when they realize that their picture of the world is missing something, and that the missing piece has been standing in the corner of their own court for 3 days, and they only just noticed it. She had ruled for 312 years. She did not enjoy being surprised, but she found, sitting there in her amberlit unease, that she could not look away. The full Galactic Tribunal was called 4 days later. It was announced at dawn and it filled the Grand Court to capacity by mid-morning. Every delegate, every aide, every council, and every guard that could fit inside the chamber was there. The ones who could not fit watched from the gallery above, pressed against the glass railings, looking down at the floor where something important was about to happen. The subject of the tribunal was the forged scroll. The registrar's office had confirmed, after 2 days of analysis, that the document was not merely falsified. It was part of a much larger filing that had been constructed over the course of 8 months. Someone had built an entire legal case, piece by piece, designed to strip the Earth Coalition of its provisional seat before the Accord's vote. The case included forged correspondence, altered timestamps in official records, and 3 separate witness declarations filed under false names. It was careful work, the kind of work that took time and money and access. The presiding court officer opened the tribunal with a formal statement that named the investigation and its findings to date, and then he opened the floor for additional evidence. He said it calmly, in the flat ceremonial voice of the court, but the chamber could feel the weight behind the words. Someone in this room had done this, and everyone in the room knew it. The first 2 hours of testimony came from the registrar's analysts and the court security office. They laid out the technical evidence with charts and document comparisons, speaking in the careful language of people who deal in facts and want to stay within them. They established what the forgeries were, when they were filed, and approximately what resources would have been required to produce them. They could not establish who had produced them. That was when the presiding officer turned to the Earth Coalition's table and asked if the Coalition had anything to add. Ambassador Vane stood. She said that she did have something to add. She said she would like to call Sergeant Uriel Doran as a witness. The chamber reacted the way still water reacts to a stone. A ripple of noise moved from the center outward. Some delegates whispered to their aides. Some aides whispered to each other. A few of the older, more composed delegates simply straightened in their seats and said nothing, which was its own kind of reaction. A guard as a tribunal witness was unusual. A human guard was something the court did not have a procedure for. The presiding officer paused. He consulted the rule. Register. He found no rule against it. He granted the request. Urel walked from the coalition's table to the witness position at the center of the floor. She stood in the marked circle, hands behind her back, and looked at the presiding officer. He asked her to state anything relevant that she had observed during the court sessions of the past 2 weeks. Urel began to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not use notes. She did not hesitate. She recited, in precise and complete detail, 17 separate conversations that she had heard while standing at her post near the servants' corridor. She named the speakers by their delegation and position. She gave the words directly, in the original Velcaran court dialect where they had been spoken, and then translated them into standard language for the record. She gave the time of each conversation, the approximate distance from her post, and the names of any third parties who had passed by during each exchange. The chamber did not make a sound. The conversations Urel recited were damning in ways that built slowly and then all at once. The first few sounded like ordinary political discussion, strategy, concern about the accords, displeasure with the human delegation's presence. But as the testimony continued, the pieces assembled into something much darker. There were direct references to the forgery operation, using terms and code phrases that the registrar's analysts immediately recognized as matching language found in the falsified documents. There were names of aides who had placed the false filings, names of counselors who had arranged payment, and one name above all the others that the chamber had not expected to hear. Lord Veth Khan of the Second House, one of the oldest families in the Velcaran Dominion. A man who was seated in that chamber right now, 12 tables to the left of the Earth Coalition, and who had gone the color of pale bone. Urel finished her testimony and waited. The presiding officer asked her how she had understood those conversations, given that they were conducted in Velcaran court dialect, a language not included in the coalition's registered diplomatic briefings. Urel said she had studied it for 8 months before the assignment. She said she had worked from archived court transcripts and a set of language records that the Velcaran Cultural Office had published as a historical document 3 years prior. She said she had practiced with a language program and verified her comprehension level with 2 Velcaran-speaking scholars at a university on Earth before departing. The presiding officer asked why she had not disclosed this language knowledge upon arrival. Urel said that no one had asked. Another ripple moved through the chamber, quieter this time, and more uncomfortable, because the answer was completely true, and everyone in the room could feel exactly what it meant. They had not asked because they had not considered it necessary. They had not considered it necessary because they had looked at the human guard in the dim corner and decided she was not worth asking. Lord Veth Khan's counsel stood and objected, citing lack of verification, citing the impossibility of memory accuracy at that level, citing procedural irregularities in how the testimony had been submitted. The presiding officer asked Urel if she could be cross-examined on the specific content of her recollections. Urel said yes. The cross-examination lasted 3 hours. The Lord's counsel tested every conversation, every name, every time reference. He found no errors. He sat down. By the end of the day, 2 more houses had been implicated through cross-referencing Urel's testimony with the registrar's document analysis. Aides were escorted from the chamber. Councillors requested immediate legal representation. Lord Veth Khan sat completely still, which was, in a room full of creatures who could not stay still, the most telling thing of all. The presiding officer called a recess until the following morning. As the chamber emptied, Urel walked back to the coalition table and stood behind Ambassador Vane's chair. Vane turned and looked up at her for a moment. She did not have the right words for what she wanted to say, so she said nothing. She just nodded once. Urel nodded back. Then she stood up straight, clasped her hands behind her back, and waited for the room to clear. From the throne, Queen Sovariel watched the chamber empty around the still figure in the corner. She watched the powerful and the proud file out through the tall doors, many of them diminished, some of them broken, and she watched the human stand there as she always stood, as if the weight of the room meant nothing at all. The Queen thought about the 8 months of study, the 6 hours of stillness, the 5 seconds of action, the 40 minutes of perfect memory. She thought about the dim corner, the bad light, and the satisfied smile of the aide who had put Urel there. She thought about how that aide had placed the most dangerous witness in the history of this court directly beside the people he most needed to keep secrets from. And she allowed herself, very quietly, something that felt almost like a smile of her own. The tribunal reconvened the next morning and ended before noon. The evidence was complete. The cross-referencing was complete. The legal apparatus of the Velcaran sovereignty, which was ancient and slow and very thorough, had done its work. Lord Veth Khan and the members of the Second House conspiracy were formally charged with 17 counts of court fraud, document falsification, and conspiracy against a protected diplomatic delegation. 2 other houses were cited as secondary participants and placed under formal review. The forged documents were struck from the record. The Earth Coalition's provisional seat was confirmed. The Expansion Accord's vote was scheduled for 3 days hence, and the Earth Coalition was confirmed as a full participant. Ambassador Vane received the news at the coalition table and kept her expression completely neutral until the chamber began to fill with the noise of reaction, and then she allowed herself one long, slow exhale. She did not celebrate openly. She had learned a long time ago that celebrating in front of people who had just lost was a fast way to make lasting enemies, but she felt it, quietly, in the way a person feels a weight lift off their shoulders after carrying it for a very long time. Uriel stood at her post. The post in the dim corner, near the servants' corridor, with the faint smell of cleaning solution and the bad light. She had stood there every day of the proceedings, through every session, through every hour of the tribunal. She had not been reassigned to a better post. The Velcaran hosts had not offered one, and Uriel had not requested one. She stood where she was put, did her job from there, and that was the end of it as far as she was concerned. The chamber was beginning to empty when the Queen's herald stepped into the center of the floor and struck the announcing staff against the stone 3 times. The signal for a royal declaration. The noise dropped immediately. Every head turned to the throne. Queen Sovereal rose. She was not wearing her ceremonial court dress today. She wore the deep black formal robes of Velcaran ruling judgment, which was a much older garment with a much heavier meaning. The robes were worn only for moments of consequence, the kind of moments that would be recorded and remembered for generations. The chamber was completely silent. The Queen spoke in Old Velcaran first, the formal language of declarations, used for things that needed to carry real weight. Then she spoke in standard language, so that every delegation in the room could understand every word. She said that it was the right and the honor of the sovereign to recognize those whose presence had changed the course of events in the Grand Court. She said that this right had been exercised 9 times in the recorded history of the Dominion. She said she was exercising it a 10th time today. She named the title Veth Corral. The word moved through the chamber like a current. Older delegates recognized it immediately, and their reactions were visible. A slight straightening of posture, the careful stillness of people who understood the weight of what they were hearing. Younger delegates and foreign aides leaned to their neighbors and asked what it meant, and the answers that came back were whispered and wide-eyed. Witness of the court, one whose presence changes the room. It was the highest individual recognition the Velcaran sovereignty could grant to a non-sovereign. It had never in its recorded history been granted to a member of a species that did not yet hold a permanent council seat. It had never been granted to a guard. The Queen spoke Uriel's full name and rank clearly into the silent chamber. Uriel walked from her corner to the center of the floor. She moved the same way she always moved, steady, direct, without hurry. She stopped in the marked circle and looked at the Queen. She did not bow. Coalition diplomatic protocol did not require it, and Uriel followed her protocols. She gave the respectful formal nod of the Earth Coalition, and the Queen received it without comment. The herald placed a small carved token in Uriel's hand, black stone, shaped like an open eye, warm from having been kept close to the throne, the Vethkaral token, an object that would open every official door in the Velcaran. Sovereignty and mark Uriel, in any formal context, as someone whose testimony and observation carried the full weight of a royal witness. Then it was done. The chamber reacted, not with cheering, because this was not a room where people cheered, but with the particular quality of silence that means everyone present has just decided, at the same moment, that what they witnessed mattered. Some delegates were displeased, and their displeasure was easy to read in the set of their faces and the angle of their shoulders. A title like this, given to a human, to a guard, to a member of a species with a provisional seat, it was an upset of the established order, and the established order did not enjoy being upset. But the Queen had spoken, and the Queen's words in this court were law. Uriel returned to her corner. She put the token in her jacket pocket. She clasped her hands behind her back, stood up straight, and waited for the session to formally close. That evening, after the chamber had emptied and the coalition delegation had returned to their guest quarters, Queen Sovereal sat in her private council room with her first council and 2 senior advisors. It was a small room compared to the court. No Dead Star walls, no crystal windows, just a round table, 4 chairs, and a low fire burning quietly in the grate. The first council asked the Queen, carefully, why she had done it. The Queen looked into the fire for a long moment. Then she said that she had been thinking about something since the very first session, since the first time she had looked at the human in the dim corner and noticed that the human was not moving. She said she had spent 3 centuries studying power, and she had believed, sincerely and completely believed, that she had a full and accurate picture of what power looked like. She said she had been wrong. She said that her people had catalogued every dangerous species in the galaxy with great care. They had measured claws and venom and armored hide and raw physical strength and the reach of psychic ability and their depth of ancient technology. They had been thorough, and they had been proud of their thoroughness, and that pride had blinded them to a question none of them had ever seriously asked. What kind of creature survives on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill everything living on it? What kind of creature claws its way up from that, looks at the stars, and immediately starts studying them? What kind of creature has a lifespan so short it cannot afford to waste a single day, and so chooses, instead of grieving that, to fill every single day with preparation? She said they had looked at humans and seen soft bodies, short lives, and a civilization barely 2 generations old in space, and they had decided that was the whole picture. They had placed a human soldier in the worst corner of the most important room in the galaxy and handed her an insult, and she had accepted it without a word and turned it into the best listening post in the building. She had given them 8 months of silent preparation, 6 hours of perfect stillness, 5 seconds of precise and controlled action, and 40 minutes of flawless memory, and every single one of those things had come from the same place. Not from armor, not from weapons, not from any gift the galaxy had given humans. From a choice, a quiet, patient, deeply human choice to prepare completely, to pay full attention, and to do the work that no one in the room had expected them to do. The Queen said that was the most dangerous thing she had encountered in 300 years of rule. Not because it was violent, but because it was patient. Because it did not need to be seen to be effective. Because it worked best when no one was watching. Her first council was quiet for a long time. Then she asked what the Queen intended to do about the Earth Coalition going forward. The Queen looked into the fire. She said, "Give them the permanent seat." She said it before the vote, before the accords were signed, before any of the formal process that was still to come. She said it as if it were already finished, because in her mind it was. She said that a species that sent its soldiers to foreign courts, put them in the bad corner, told them to be quiet and watch, and produced results like this, was not a species you kept at the edge of the table. She paused. She looked at the fire one more time. Then she said, "That is the kind of species you want sitting very close." And then she said nothing more, because the Queen of the Velcaran Dominion had said everything that needed to be said, and anything added after it would have only made it smaller.